Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome, I'm so glad you're here. My name is Marcy Mederi, and I work for the Catholic parishes of Oak Park with this collaborative that we call Spirit and Light. And I am here to welcome you to this beautiful space of the St. Catherine, St. Lucie, St. Giles Parish on the St. Giles campus in McDonough Hall. And welcome to all of you who are joining in on the live stream. So it is great to be able to come together on such an important topic, right? And to share our hearts, to share our faith, and to listen to really great wisdom that will inspire us and encourage us and give us food for the journey. So those of you who are in the room, refreshments are behind me and the restrooms are behind you. So do as you need. So I'd like to bring up Colleen, who will lead us in prayer.
Let us pray. Loving God, you create every person in your image and unite us all in one human family. As our sisters and brothers keepers, fill us with courage and compassion, that we might meet the hardships of migrants and refugees, not with silence and indifference, but with generous acts of mercy, welcoming every stranger as Christ in our midst. Amen.
Good evening. I would like to introduce Father Dan. Oh, I'm sorry, this went blank on me. Just read it from here. Reverend Daniel G. Groody, C.S.C., Ph.D., is a Holy Cross priest, Vice President and Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education, a Fellow and Trustee, and a Professor of Theology and Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. His primary responsibilities include advancing undergraduate teaching, research, and outreach. Father Groody is an award-winning author, teacher, and film producer. He has written 4 books, edited or co-edited 5 books, and written numerous articles that have been translated into 9 languages. His scholarship delves into the intersection of theology and migration, offering insights into the human experience of displacement and the role of faith in addressing social and global challenges. His latest book, A Theology of Migration, The Bodies of Refugees and the Body of Christ, won first-place honors from the Catholic Press Association. Internationally recognized as an expert on migration and refugee issues, and drawing on research and speaking engagements in more than 50 countries, Father Groody has collaborated with institutions such as the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, and the United Nations. He has also produced several internationally acclaimed films and documentaries, including Dying to Live, A Migrant's Journey. He is the recipient of a Centennial Medal from Catholic Charities and a winner of an award for the sustained excellence in undergraduate teaching. He currently teaches a course titled The Heart's Desire and Social Change, which enables students to discover the connection between the deepest desires of their hearts and the needs and challenges of the world. Father Groody earned his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame, a Master of Divinity degree, and a licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology, and a doctorate in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. He also completed postdoctoral work at Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center. His engagement with policymakers, scholars, and religious leaders underscores the integral relationship among Christian faith, global justice, the dignity of the human person, and theological reflection. In addition to his research, scholarship, and teaching, Father Groody is a former downhill ski racer, loves woodworking, yeah, I was impressed by that too, and once rode a bicycle from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. And now, Father Groody.
Well, thank you for inviting me to just share a few words with you tonight, and I want to also thank the Dominican sisters of Cincinnati, who were kind enough on that bike trip to give us lodging to homeless migrants who were passing through that area. So I do remember that very well, as I mentioned earlier. Before I came here, I was invited to go out and share in some of the ministries you're doing in the area. And I do recognize I'm in the company of some amazingly great people who do that work. Father Ed Shea, Sister Joanne, who's here, Sister Lena. I know people who have been doing this work for years, many others who I kind of met tonight. And what a pleasure it was to just see some of this work at St. Edmunds, and I know in this area, really impressive. And thank you for just inviting me to just listen to what a lot of the different things you're doing. So I couldn't help but just be impressed by your commitment, your engagement, and even you're putting your faith into action. So tonight I just want to share, just put some of this stuff in context. We're doing work in different ways. It took me a little while to figure this out because the reflections we're going to share tonight first came out of my experience of living in Latin America and being really touched by the people that I met. And then years later, when I really worked in pastoral ministry in Hispanic parishes, I remember being very touched by the stories that people told me, their struggle to live dignified lives, some of the indignities they were suffering, but there was something that was very profound in my encounters and experiences and interchanges with them. So as things evolved in my own life, I thought I was going to stay in pastoral ministry. I thought I was going to work at the border and migrant camps in Southern California, but eventually I was called to come back to teach. But I thought if I'm going to teach, I want to reflect on these experiences. So when I worked with different spaces, I began to realize that we're all doing different things. Some are working in pastoral ministry and direct engagement. Some are doing advocacy in Washington and other places, and here certainly with state governments and local governments. Some are kind of working in education. So I'm going to offer you just some of those perspectives of the research that I've been doing probably over the last 3 decades or so on this, and just hopefully that just kind of offers something, especially to many of you who are on the front lines and working at this, day in and day out, and often kind of wonder, why am I doing this? And what gives meaning, and how do I understand my faith commitment to this? So as I was working on this, it occurred to me that there's really 3 levels of engagement with a theology of migration. And when I first started this, I was mentioning this tonight at dinner, when I first started this, probably almost 4 decades ago, migration, as you know, there's many people in this room too who would have been at this time probably working on this issue. This really wasn't a big issue in the church. It wasn't even that big of an issue in society. Somewhat under the Reagan administration, it became an issue. But by and large in the churches, we weren't really preoccupied with this issue. This issue has obviously become one of the most foremost issues. I could not have seen at the time how big this issue would become. And I have to say that, even when I was beginning some of I remember giving my job talk at Notre Dame almost 25 years ago. And, at one point, it's a very kind of critically engaged discussion. Scholars really ask a lot of critical questions. But one of them was, this really isn't theology. This is sociology, or this is political science, or social science. And then I said, no, it is theology. But they said, well, if it is, you haven't actually done that yet. And as much as the critique kind of stung, it was a challenge because I knew there was something theological about it. But I think the work from then is to say, how do I really begin to articulate what a theology of migration is about? So I offer a first word on that, and I'm going to really talk about what this means in light of the Eucharist. But again, a lot of this comes out of my pastoral experience, and so I think there's 3 levels of looking at a theology of migration. So the first is really looking at the theological level, and that's what we actually do on behalf of migrants. So what's happening at St. Edmunds, what's happening in the parishes, we see migrants who are in need. They're vulnerable legally, they need clothing, they need jobs, they need language support, cultural support, family support. And so it's goes this way. It really helps those who are on the move. The second is really the spiritual level. And so one of the things I did in many different contexts, different borders around the world, mountains, canals, post-genocide, human trafficking, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, was trying to say, well, what's this feel like on the inside? I was really interested. I'm really a person interested in spirituality more than anything. And so I was really interested in the journey into the human heart. So I'd often ask migrants, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Or what would you say to people if you were here tonight, if you were in my shoes? And so really understanding the inner landscape, that's always been a deep interest of mine. The third is really saying that these come together on a theological level and really asking, what does it mean to be human before God? How do we think about God from a migration perspective? And all of this, I think, is a way of thinking about a theology of migration. So they're interconnected levels. They kind of have a way of speaking to each other. They build on each other. But again, what you're doing here at St. Edmunds or St. Giles is different than what I'm doing at Notre Dame, which is different what the Bishops' Conference is doing in lobbying for legislative reform. But I think holistically, we're trying to carry out this mission of the church. And I think we can each do stuff in different ways. So hopefully this will add to some of the work you're doing. But I have to say first, well, let me just go back a second, I don't know how I got into this issue. This issue found me more than I found it. And I'm so glad it did, because it just has been such an amazing journey. I grew up kind of in the Northeast. We moved around a lot because my dad worked for the phone company. But we came from Irish heritage. My name, Daniel, means God is my judge. Vistos is my mother's maiden name, which means uncultivated. And Groody means crooked. It's actually an Irish name. So with that as a background, I remember I buried my uncle, whose name was Bill Groody, and he was my godfather. So I got news that he passed away. And so we actually went to where he was from in Ashland, Pennsylvania, and we had a funeral mass. Then after the funeral mass, we buried Bill Groody's body into the ground. And it was a couple of hours after the funeral that I got an email from a man, and he said, a note from Bill Groody on the message line. So it's like, oh my God, he made it. He's wireless now, and he wanted to tell me he was okay. And so I answered, and he said, my name is Bill Groody. I found your name on the internet. And he said, I live out in the Bay Area, or kind of live just north of the Bay Area near the Napa Valley. He says, if you're ever out this way, I'd love to connect. So I was coming out in a couple weeks, and my community had a house in the Bay Area, and so they knew I was coming to visit. But then when I came through the door, they said, will you be here for dinner? And I said, yes. I met somebody on the internet, and I invited him over for dinner as well. You can imagine that any community or family situation, there's just a deep kind of like, what? And so people were a little nervous, kind of little chill in the air, I think, when he came through the door. But after a while, we began to compare notes, and we began to realize that we were connected to two brothers who came over from Ireland through Canada into the United States around 1800. And then in those days, you just really didn't marry outside the clan, or you didn't really leave sort of the Catholic Church in this case. But these two brothers got into a fight because one married outside the clan. And the other was so angry at him that he says, the way I want to get back at him is by becoming a Protestant. So his family became Protestant, and my family stayed Catholic. And so it took 200 years to get the orange and green back together again. But Bill and I became great friends. We ended up working on film projects together. We ended up doing some other research. But at one point, we actually did this DNA research. And so, there's been quite a bit of research done, especially since 2001 on the front line of the White House. There was an announcement that they had deciphered the sequence of DNA. And to give somewhat of a sense of what the genome looks like, if you were to put a stack of paper as high as the Washington Monument in 12-point font, you get a sense of how many characters are really on this genome strand. But by looking at certain markers and comparing those with indigenous communities, you can actually trace back your migration heritage 80,000 years. Which is exactly what this map shows. So Bill and I did this independently, and this actually is my family's migration history over the last 80,000 years. So, and then it just disappears just like that. So it's here today and gone. We're not quite sure what happened here. Here we go. So this whole stuff about, Trump, migration, all that kind of stuff, this isn't even a blip on the radar. This has been happening since the beginning of time. But you can see why people, through war, through scarcity, through just very different kinds of uprooting, climate change. People have been moving. Yeah. Can someone prime up the volume a little bit? I'm not sure. Marcy, if you're able to pick up the volume. Yes. So through these different climactic changes, they're having a little trouble hearing on this side.
It's as loud as it can be, and I can hear it there.
Okay. I'll try to lift this up a little bit. So, migration, here in our genes, and it's something that's just part of our whole makeup. But if we look at this further, it's also in our spiritual genes. And if you really look at the scriptures, migration goes through the whole text from beginning to end. It really starts with the first migration, Adam and Eve from Eden. And when they're cast out, identify in any particular place that we know of today. We really see the call of Abraham. The spotlight comes down to one person. In the beginning of that narrative that we can locate in East, which is this territory right here, he receives this call from Ur. And there he ends up listening to God's call that says, leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. So boom, this is not a God of sedentary kind of spirituality. This is a God who from the beginning. And so he calls Abraham to move. He doesn't have a full blueprint either. And you can see today, these would be actually the territories that he would have migrated through. He would have gone through Iraq, up in the Tigris and Euphrates River, up into what is now southern Turkey, down to Haran, coming down into the Fertile Crescent here by Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, and then moving his way back again. So interesting, this is one of the major epicenters also today still of migration, from the Iraqi war to the Syrian civil war. Many of these folks have moved into these neighboring countries of Lebanon, of Iraq, of Jordan. We still even hear the most protracted refugee situation still to this day are the Palestinians. They're under a different refugee accord than others because they say we actually aren't refugees, this is our land. So that's a longer story. But this really is something where you see from Abraham to the patriarchs, to the Exodus in Israel, to the prophets in the desert, to ultimately, and when you really get through sort of the exile of Israel and the diaspora, that it goes through the Old Testament. But then we come to Jesus himself, who really became a migrant. He became a refugee. Then he calls his disciples to move to the ends of the earth to proclaim the gospel. And the text ends with Jesus most in exile, seeing New Jerusalem, where he says the world is fundamentally a migrant. So from beginning to end, migration shapes the whole text.
You're brilliant.
Thank you.
Right, you're
Thank you.
fantastic, and I think your lavalier is cutting in and out for people at home. So you can be at this one, or we can give you a handheld.
I'll just do it. So migration is in our spiritual genes. It's in our national genes as well. Certainly this country is a country that from the beginning to end has really been a country that's both welcomed migrants and has had a strong, very anti-migrant rhetoric. I'm at a school of the Fighting Irish, which really was the cry of an immigrant community who were discriminated against. The Fighting Irish wasn't just a football slogan, it was actually the cry of an immigrant community that said, hey, we're fighting for human dignity. But what happened with sort of the Irish and happened to the Italians, happened to the Germans, the Lithuanians, happened to the Chinese very severely, happened to the Filipinos, and the list goes on up until our own day, to the Latinos, to the Muslims, or whoever else it might be. So underneath this, there are some common patterns. And so while we're living this in our own particular generation, when we look at it really more holistically and historically, there is also a transgenerational dynamic that goes on of otherness and excluding, and especially in a fear of the other. So today, this is one of the probably more dominant images coming out. You've got two main kind of strands coming up. You have one coming up from Latin America. You have another coming up, obviously, from sub-Saharan Africa and the African continent. But many of them coming from Africa are on boats like this one. And some of these boats hold as many as 700 people. And they're moving from places like Libya, especially after the Arab Spring. We saw kind of a rush of these. Gaddafi and others were just rushing people out of there. The collapse of governments, poverty, human rights violations pushed people to take desperate measures to get on boats to flee northwards towards Europe. And what happened in one case is, but this happens regularly, it still happens many times today. If you want to get some of the sheer numbers of these, there's a website called Missing Migrants, and you can imagine that when people capsize in this area, that we often don't know how many really have died. But in this particular case, there were hundreds and hundreds of migrants on a boat. And when it capsized, only 8 people survived. And they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. And when the fishermen saw them clinging to that net, instead of saving them, they actually severed their nets and cast them to die in the ocean depths. And one of the persons who first heard about that was Pope Francis, and he had just been elected Pope. And when he heard about this, he made a visit to the small island of Lampedusa, which is only 6 square miles. And there he celebrated Mass on an ocean harbor to condemn a globalization of indifference to these human beings, but also to really say that God really cares about these people, who the world regards as nobodies. So, but he used a chalice made from the driftwood of a refugee boat, which is rather extraordinary. And so the question for me became, what does it mean to use a chalice from the driftwood of a refugee boat? You know, what does it mean to use a chalice at Mass from the driftwood of a refugee boat? That was a theological question. But when he celebrated Mass, you can see they used this carpenter who did it, who I'll say more about. They only had 8 days to prepare for this. And so he celebrated Mass over this small little boat. You can see the chalice there that he used, and he used a number of other things as well, were the remains of these shipwrecks of the wood that came ashore. So it left me thinking, how do we think about the Eucharist and migration together? And that really became the substance of my work. But it really started much earlier than that. Around 2000, I was invited to join some members of the Bishops' Conference to go to a Mass at the U.S.-Mexico border. This was one that was in Arizona sometime later, but every year they have a Mass down there where half the communities in Mexico, half the communities in the United States, and they join the altar together at the wall. So I thought, what does it mean to celebrate the Eucharist in the midst of a divided political reality? And what is the meaning of the Eucharist in a context like this? Right? And let me be clear, it's not the instrumentalization of the liturgy for some political purpose. It's actually just the opposite. It's actually highlighting the role of the liturgy as a spiritual commitment that has political ramifications. You know, so this is fundamentally a spiritual vision. So what I'm offering really is not some kind of commentary per se on politics. That can be a derivative of this, but the primary thing is I'm trying to ask this question, as are you, what does it mean to live out my faith in light of the challenges of social issues like migration? And how do we understand who God is? How do we understand who we are? How do we understand who we are in relationship to one another? That's sort of what this is about. So I think as I began to think about this theologically, again, when I first kind of got into this field, people are like, this isn't theological. But I thought, well, if it is theological, how do we think about what's happening inside churches and outside churches? So that just kind of gave more of a context of thinking about migration and the Eucharist together. So what I really want to say here today, and there's 4 parts to this talk, is saying that this is the core idea, is that while the fundamental kind of narrative of the world about migrants is really about from our oneness as a human family to otherness, it's fundamentally about othering the migrant. The movement of the Eucharist is in the opposite direction. It's taking the Humpty Dumptiness of our brokenness. This is my technical theological explanation of it. It's taking our Humpty Dumptiness and trying to put it back together so we really move back to our union and communion. So the long journey of life, or the long migration of life, is about a journey to communion. right? So in that light, I really want to not only give some more information about migration, but I really want to open up a new imagination about migration and look at migration theologically and look at it theologically in light of the Eucharist. And as we know, there's 4 parts in the Roman Rite of the Eucharist. There's an opening rite, there's a liturgy of the Word, liturgy of the Eucharist, a communion rite. The structure of this talk and the structure of my book on a theology of migration really follows this, because ultimately what I was trying to do was to reshape a Eucharistic narrative, reshape the narrative around migration into a Eucharistic narrative. So the first part of this talk is really to look at an introductory rite, which is speak about the times that we live in as the age of migration. The second is what I want to look at the debated territory, and that's really the liturgy of words. The third part is to look at the liturgy at Lampedusa, which is really more the theological territory. And then the last part is the concluding rite, which is the mission territory. So these are the 4 kind of parts of the talk, and I'll go for about another 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll just have questions and then kind of go from there, right? So, but at any point, if you want to stop or just ask questions, feel free to. So it's, this is more than just taking a theology concept and actually imposing it on reality. The opposite is this. This is very an organic process. The method for me was, let's start with the interviews with migrants. Let's look at the context they're living in. Let's look at the state of the world. It is more kind of a methodology of social action or of liberation hermeneutics, which basically is to say, before we actually kind of ask the theological question, let's look at what's going on in reality. People are suffering. People are migrating. People are dying. Let's look at that first. So that's the place where I start, but if we look at this together, let's just start with the numbers of migrants. So this is really the social context out of which we do theological reflection. And it begins by saying that today there are more international migrants than ever before. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's not a new topic. It's been going on since the beginning of time. But what is different today are the sheer numbers. Today there are more than 281 million international migrants in the world, and those are people who are living away from their homeland for more than a year, right? Not all of those are vulnerable, but that means that 1 out of every 28 people in the world is a migrant, but 100 million of those are refugees. Now, refugees are those who can make a documentary account of the fact that if they get sent back to their homelands, they'd be tortured, killed, or persecuted, by some of the actually kind of criteria of the United Nations. This number, I mean, since I've been working on this, has grown exponentially each year. And to put that in more perspective, that if refugees were a particular country, if they were settled in one place, they'd be the 21st largest country in the world. And they would be growing out 38,000 people a day, or 24 people per minute, right? This is a tremendous upheaval. But if you also look at those migrating within the borders of a country, they're internally displaced, sometimes looking for work, sometimes because of the breakdown of the rule of law, sometimes because of the need for seeking provisions for their families. There could be as many as 1 billion migrants, which is 1 out of every 7 people in the world today. So this issue is not going away. It does not matter even what this administration does on this issue. This is going to continue. This would be like trying to stop the flow of Niagara Falls, right? And the reality is going to win. But, when I was doing some prior work on globalization and justice, we have to be very careful about some of this imagery about immigration's flooding us or taking jobs or ruining our culture. Because here's a real kind of Here was an illuminating set of statistics when I was doing some research on this. That as we look at the global imbalances today, 19% of the world lives on less than $1 a day. 48% of the world lives on less than $2 a day. 75% of the world lives on less than $10 a day. 95% of the world lives on less than $50 a day. The top 1% of the world has as much as the poorest 57% of the world. And the 3 richest people in the world have as much as the poorest 48 nations. When we look at those numbers, we begin to realize that migration is not the problem. Migration is a symptom of deeper problems which cause the imbalances for people to move in the first place. But we can add to that
the collapse of the rule of law, where people aren't protected. Sometimes people cross borders simply to be protected. We could add to that the violation of civil rights, religious persecution, human trafficking, escaping from violence. There's many others to that. So when you start listening to these stories, as I know many of you have, you begin to say, this is not a simple narrative, right? And not only that, but when you just, if we're not moved by these stories, then we have deeper problems than migration in our country, right? Which I'll say more about. But all of these numbers have a human face. This was one of, for about a dozen years, I was on the Bishops' Conference Committee on Migration and Refugees. And each year we would go to areas of concern, look at the outflows of refugees during the ISIS crisis, or the Iraqi civil or Syrian war, or whatever that was. And we go to areas of concern where people were very vulnerable, and to really speak with them. But this was one that was happening after the Syrian civil war. The woman with her head in her hands had already lost 3 sons. Her 4th son was just put in prison, and her grandson had just been killed. And these are some of her daughters-in-law who just lost their husbands. And these are Muslim women. And I'll never forget what that was like to just encounter them and to really be in that moment. Some women still had bullet holes in them because they had no medical care. And at that moment, I felt like I'd never seen the Pietà carved out a living experience. I was very moved when I saw it in person in Rome the first time, but when I saw it in living flesh and blood, of really a woman literally holding the death of her son, if you will, figuratively in her hands, I began to realize that this story just takes on deeply biblical proportions. So this is where I think we come down to saying that a theology of migration ultimately is framed around the human person and the human experience. And it's from there that we begin to do theological reflection. But before getting into the theological reflection, if you will, I was once giving a talk with some folks in Rochester, Minnesota, and some people from the Mayo Clinic were there, and I mentioned this story once, and I said when I was about 8 years old, I found this pamphlet in this rest area, and my family and I were on this road trip, and it said, did you realize that you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches? And I was like, wow. So I kind of opened it up, and it said, the distance between the head and the heart is 18 inches. And God is not just someone to understand conceptually, but someone to encounter in one's heart. And it's that distance between the head and the heart that makes the big difference. And so this woman was a nurse there, and she said, well, you only got that partially right, she said. She said, actually, there's a carotid artery that carries blood from the head down to the lungs and then carries it back again. And she said, if you cut off that circulation, then it actually just would give you toxicity and you die in no time. And I said, well, that's actually a good insight, because this is what we're trying to do, is to not just sort of being bleeding hearts and saying migrants are suffering. We're trying to think about this. We're trying to actually filter this through the heart as people of faith and people of love, trying to bring that back to the head to think about it again, and this circulatory process is what's going on. But perhaps the Native Americans have it even better. They said the long migration of human life is a journey from the head to the heart to the feet, and then back again. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. But that's part of what I'm doing here in this process, is starting in the outside world, then going to the head, going to the heart, theology, then going to mission with the feet. But the second part of this talk is I want to look about how people think about this. And in this part, I just want to say 2 things. Is that migration is an incredibly, incredibly complex issue. And if people don't understand that complexity, either they aren't listening to what's happening or they don't understand. The second thing I've learned from this issue is that it's an incredibly, incredibly simple issue. And if people don't realize that, they either aren't listening or they don't understand. This is really, what it is. We have to really deal with its complexity, and we have to actually look at its core. It's really about human dignity. Even, I think today, Celine, when we were talking about giving clothes with dignity or something like that, whatever the name of your bodega is, that's really what it is. It's not just giving handouts to people, but it's like helping people restore some dignity even by having something nice to wear. That dignity just runs through all of it. It's really at the core. But, in the course of doing this research, I had a chance to work with a lot of different interesting people. And at some point, I made some real mistakes, kind of going out into the field and interviewing people, or just taking risks in kind of border areas that I just made a lot of mistakes. That's a whole other kind of conversation. But at one point I said, I think I could get further if I actually work with some of the institutional actors, and some of them were the Border Patrol. At one point I was working with the Border Patrol, and they'd take me in their helicopters or search and rescue. They'd bring me out on their ride-alongs. And at one point I was with a ride-along, and we were just kind of driving along. I always just introduced myself as a researcher in the beginning. By the end of the day, I told them I was a priest. I always wanted to see what kind of change that did in them. And sometimes it opened a door, sometimes it closed one. But in this case, I was riding along with this one agent, and he said, we were riding along in this, Border Patrol truck, and so he said, one time we were coming through this area, and these are his words, he says, and these aliens came across. And, then he said, I went after them. And even they would have said at that time, certainly, that 98% of the people coming across are hardworking people looking for a job. There are 2% that are really involved in serious criminal activity, and indeed that's where the activity, the law enforcement activity should be directed. But in this case, this was part of that 2%, and these people are coming across. So they turned across. They were smuggling drugs or something. They turned around and just started raining machine gun down upon them. And so he said he hit the deck, and he said he was filled with fear, and he said he saw his life pass before his eyes. He said for months, he said he had to go to counseling, and it affected his marriage. He'd wake up with nightmares. And suddenly this person who I had been working with kind of migrants, so I knew those stories. I hadn't known these stories. And I felt for the guy. I thought, this guy's putting himself on the line every day, And so as we got further along in the day, I said, well, how do you know which vehicles to stop? And he gave me a couple descriptors. And it was no more than 2 minutes after this happened that this vehicle went by that looked very suspicious. And so he quickly went from being public relations agent on Border Patrol duty with me to actually be in hot pursuit of this vehicle. So he changed gears, put on his lights, sirens, he went after this vehicle. And then suddenly, doors flew open, clouds of dust, and these migrants just went running out in every direction. And what was surprising to me, I was so much in the mind of this Border Patrol agent at that moment that my first reaction was, oh my gosh, I hope he gets them. And then wait a minute. Then I woke up, I'm wait a minute. I thought about all these migrants I work with, no, I hope they get away, And then I'm run, And then, as he's running after them, in the back of the truck that they were in, they just had pictures of their family at a baptism at church. And I was why are we running after these people? So I thought, this is a hard issue. This is a complicated issue. But I think at that point, too, I said, now I have to actually, as a researcher, really get into more complexity on this, not less. And so from that point on, I went out to speak to Border Patrol agents, congressional leaders, human rights advocates, vigilante groups, hospital administrators, business owners, and to just say, give me your best position on migration. I wasn't even going there to change what they're thinking. I just wanted to descriptively know what they're thinking. So this is the fruit of many years of research. And again, I would probably say this is reflective of our own context. It has some durability in terms of what we've seen across different administrations even. But it's also transnational and it's transhistorical in the sense that if you go to different countries, you see the same dynamic going on. If you look throughout history, we see these same dynamics going on. They might have somewhat different names, but the dynamics are the same. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly, but we can come back to any of this. But the first group are these kind of very far-right groups, the vigilante groups. And when you talk to them, they'll say, look, we want to protect property along the border. We want to prevent unlawful entry, and we want to fill in the gaps where federal enforcement fails. At best, it's a nuisance, but at worst, it's dangerous. It's destroying our properties, leaving all kinds of trash behind. They're making it very difficult for us. So these are concerned citizens who really are taking the law in their own hands to protect unlawful entry of people crossing the borders. The next are the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. Their job is to enforce policy. They'll say that their job is not to make it, it's to enforce it, to ensure order and prevent unlawful entry, especially of foreign invaders who could harm its citizens. And believe me, this changed a lot, after 9/11. And I had my family members I had 4 family members in the buildings when the Trade Center hit. My brother-in-law subsequently died from what happened to the Trade Center. We lost 19 people in my home parish because of this, so this is not something to take lightly. But from that point on, and I worked with the Border Patrol prior to 911 and after that it shifted dramatically. It was no longer about preventing unlawful entry, it's keeping terrorists out. So migrant and terrorists became conflated. The next are political leaders. Their job is to create the federal policy, to protect the citizens of a country and to manage its resources. It's to say we can't let everybody in, and in the beginning, really, we let in almost everybody, but we made some exceptions. If you had a disease or, were an anarchist, you weren't let into the country. Nowadays, we let in almost nobody, but we make some exceptions. And so the criteria by which we define what does it mean to be an American, and especially amidst such plurality, is really part of the challenge of really our elected leaders. Corporations as well, the high and low end of the economy, some to recruit talent, some to actually do the work that no one else wants to do, are also very active in this. They're to hire cheap and or talented labor to maximize profits and to sell products at the lowest cost. But again, talent has become very important. Even right now with current policies, some scientists are saying, I don't really want to stay in the United States, if under these conditions. Church leaders have been very vocal about this. I mean, it was inspiring to really watch the bishops, be consistent and unanimous constantly on this issue, regardless of the critiques. And believe me, I would read through some of their hate mail at times, and boy, I've never seen such vicious letters written to anybody as some Catholics write to our bishops about this issue of migration. But at the heart of it, it's to proclaim a God of life and to protect the rights of human beings who are made in God's image and likeness, and to build a civilization of love. That was Paul VI's sort of vision, that the purpose of the church is to build a civilization of love, to denounce injustice and to announce the reign of God. Lastly, our human rights advocates are drawing from different philosophical principles, but in some sense intersect very much with protecting the vulnerable and being an advocate for human rights. So in this sense, there are different values being at stakes. And so really, it's not really about right or wrong, but it's about something else, different kinds of rights. So as I began to look at this, I began to say that there are different rights at stake. This group is really looking at property rights. Oftentimes, that's their primary value. This group is looking at sovereign rights, namely the right of a nation to design its laws and protect its borders. This group is looking at cultural rights, classically defined. This group is looking at economic rights and how you keep the free market open and fair. This group is looking at natural rights, those given by God, and this group is looking at human rights, classically defined. So the question then becomes, if there are different rights at stake here, and there's some argument that can be made by each one of these rights, how do you begin to prioritize these rights? How do you begin to order these rights? And by what criteria do you make those distinctions? This is where it starts to thicken a little bit. There are really three political positions in this framework. This group is close the borders, build a bigger wall, keep them out, send them back home, and just protect what we have. Obviously, this has taken new extremes with this current administration, but let's not forget that Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief and deported more people than anybody really knows. And in some sense, what Trump has been doing in this first wave is really continuing what really the Biden administration had been doing. So neither of these parties have gotten it right. But really, in this case, there has been added rhetoric, and I think added enforcement. And I think people noticeably are much more nervous because this has actually become a political cause now and a political weapon, and I think you're seeing very firsthand the people and the human beings that are suffering from this. This group is arguing for guest worker programs. We did try this in the wake of during World War II, had mixed results. And it's really a sense of like, they need the work, we need the workers, let's make a program that allows people to enter legally, all right? Let's have a legal process where people can come and or go. This group is saying that there should be at least a way to legalized citizenship. You can't simultaneously benefit from workers but not provide them rights and protections. The Catholic Church is not for completely open borders. That's not a position of the Catholic Church. It does say that there should be a path to citizenship, but there is a value to controlling borders, even though it's not seen as an absolute right of a nation. And it is subject to larger concerns of the international common good. But these are different positions, could go into much more depth, but these are the political positions. But here's where it begins to change, and here's where, again, as I said in the beginning, what's really at stake here is the narrative. That what I really want to offer is a new way of really weaving this narrative and really critically assessing the narrative that is going on right now. So if the current narrative of the current administration is, these are criminals, these are drug dealers, these are rapists, that's a narrative, right? That's a narrative. That's going to frame it very differently, all right? So, but as we look at this narrative more specifically, this group sees them as aliens. And this is actually the official language used in our official government documents, for years. But it's really strange. I had a colleague of mine from Canada, and he says, he married somebody, he was from the United States, but he married somebody from Canada, and he said, when I was in the immigration hearing, he said that the immigration officer said, "How long have you known the alien?" And it was just one of those things. It's like to speak of his life as the alien. It was just like, I was once at this conference at the United Nations, and it was state actors, UN people with church people and other religions. And at one point, someone in my small group said, the state gives rights to these people. And I looked at him and I said, no, they don't. Actually, God gives rights to these people. And it's the state's job to protect those rights. But these are different starting points. If a person crosses a border without documents, what kind of rights do they have? Do they have no rights because they shouldn't have crossed, they didn't cross legally, or do they have intrinsic rights that can't be violated regardless of what the national kind of laws are? Those are where these philosophical debates really are worked out. This group sees them as workers. Economists, as they look at this, is that there's different. They would say that the net gain of migrants over the longer haul is really where the evidence points. The first part of that, they're more needy, obviously, and you're seeing them really at the front end many times. But over the long haul, they actually more contributors than detractors. And look at some of the major kind of industries. 60% of venture capital, in recent decades has gone to really those companies where migrants were leading the companies and creating jobs for people. But look at Intel, eBay, Sun Microsystems, Google. These were all started by migrants. So the narrative they're just taking actually doesn't hold on that. But that is the rhetoric. So this group sees them as people. And this is not a very deep concept, but if we don't get this one right, then none of this other stuff is going to fall together. If these are just people that can be exploited and taken advantage of, then there are economic arguments that are going to be more persuasive than mine. But if they're people, and they're human beings made in God's image and likeness, that makes a different set of moral demands on us. So if we take this one step further, and this is where it really begins to thicken, and probably when I've ever given talks on this, this is the one pushback question I get more than any other, and it's usually some variant with various levels of aggressiveness that are, which part of illegal don't you understand? And these are by very educated people, And my friend Don Kerwin, he says sometimes you just want to say, which part of the gospel don't you understand? But that's kind of aggressive too, so that doesn't always help. But I'd like to work within the question and say, no, really the answer is what part of the law don't you understand? Because Thomas Aquinas says is that there's more to the law than just what's on the books. He said there's 4 kinds of laws. There's a natural law. In this case, parents need to feed their families. There's a civil law that are used to make ordinances for the common good. There are divine laws, which we know through Scripture, about feeding the hungry and the thirsty and the naked and the sick and the imprisoned and the estranged. And there are eternal laws through which God keeps the universe in motion. Justice happens when there's symmetry in those laws. Injustice happens when there's dissonance in those laws. Martin Luther King from a Birmingham jail could say that if you have civil laws that are against natural laws, like human dignity, that it's fundamentally unjust. So civil disobedience wasn't about anarchy, breaking laws. It was ultimately about justice, really adhering to these laws so that justice and peace could happen. So there are natural laws at work in migration, and whenever there is such discord and imbalances, like I mentioned earlier, people are going to want to move. So, but this group is going to emphasize the civil laws, and the arguments are something like, what are you, crazy? They're going to flood us. They're going to ruin our culture. They're going to keep us from being Americans. They're going to make us eat salsa, and take away ketchup. So there's just a sense like this is really bad for America, But it's really sort of an irrational thing to do. This group really speaks about the economic laws and saying, let's just let the economy work this out, which really leads us to other kind of vulnerabilities. Adam Smith, where this notion came from, really had no notion of a capitalist society. He really understood more fundamentally that if you're really going to take advantage of your neighbor, then you're not going to be able to live peacefully there. That he saw a capitalist really economy in work with a larger community. But really the great vulnerability, I think, for Israel, for every person today, is not atheism. It's not believing in God. It's actually idolatry, and it's making false gods. The vulnerability here is money theism, is making money the rule of God, and really where we worship that at all costs, and we pay human cost for that. This group really sees this, and this was a term by the United Nations of the natural laws, which is really about talking about the invisible heart. So it's really saying, what is our purpose in this life? And if we really take caring for one another out of this, and particularly reaching out to those who are vulnerable in need, that actually changes the equation, significantly in the moral calculus. So there's more they can say, but this really comes down to one question, I think, that I would like to focus on today. It's really looking at the otherness calculation. So who is the other? What is my relationship to the other? What kind of responsibilities do I have? When I'm at Notre Dame, when freshmen come, it's interesting, like everyone's scared when they arrive on campus. They don't know where they belong, but then they get in their dorm, and then they say, well, we belong to alumni, and those guys are Dylan. That means we're good, and they're bad. So they become the other. Until Michigan comes into town or any other football team, then you just say, we are ND. So you unite around that. So there's different layers of identity that go on, but the othering sort of is part of our human nature, but at some point it works against us. So this first group really defines this issue in terms of a fear of the other, the second in terms of the usefulness of the other, and the third in terms of the connection to the other. So this is where the deeper migration needs to happen, is really moving in and out of these spaces. We may occupy it for a time, but at some point we have to keep testing reality and say, does this position make me free? Am I becoming more human? Am I being more connected? Am I leading, a life that more images God's likeness, or am I moving away from that? Those are the deeper migration questions. So I want to summarize this by saying this is not just about moving across borders. This is actually a tension between sovereign rights and human rights, between civil law and natural law, between national security and human insecurity. And here I'm going to take a deeper shift between citizenship and discipleship. So it's really to say, what does it mean to fulfill the duties and expectations of being a member of the state? Again, here I'm going to go deeper into the heart and say, but what does it mean to respond to the inclusive demands of the gospel, especially if I call myself Christian? So this takes us, more into the theological territory. And I remember in context, one of the places I remember doing some research was in Morocco. And I was kind of on the border of Morocco. It's not any, since I'm in Chicago, I could probably say this. I haven't mentioned this too many times, but it was not really a good day because I was actually had to go outside of Morocco into this border town and then cross the border the next day. I had trouble getting contact. See, this is one of my stupid mistakes that I kind of did. And so I saw these people kind of rushing down the hill, kind of in this border town. I thought, gosh, I wonder what's up there. And so I go up there, and I saw this woman carrying this big box. She must have been like 80 years old, and she was carrying a big, heavy box. So I just took a picture. Then all of a sudden, I heard all this whistling and this Muslim kind of chatter, and all of a sudden, they just circled all around me, and they said, don't move. I was like, this is not good, Lord. Someone help me. So I just kind of let go, and so they're like, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm doing research. And then they kind of deleted my pictures, and then it was really dry, and my nose started to bleed. And then the commanding officer came by, and then he took my passport and he left. I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought Midnight Express. I'm like, oh my gosh, where am I going next? So then the guy goes, where are you from? No one knows where Indiana is. So I said, I'm from Chicago. And he goes, Chicago? Michael Jordan, the Bulls. I'm like, oh my God, Michael Jordan got me out of this mess. So anyway, it's a longer story, but anyways, I was interviewing some of these migrants who were hiding up in the mountains, and they had been coming from different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and I spent 3 days with them. Them telling me their story, how they crossed deserts, mountains, many people died along the way, and it was one more horrific than the other. But then after 3 days, like, they knew I was a priest, but after 3 days, it kind of the table shifted, and they said, so what do you do? And so I said, well, I said I also teach, and just me priest, I said I teach. And then I started to feel very sheepish, because I knew what I was going to say next. I says, I'm actually teaching some stuff on theology and migration. And I'm like, okay, this is the most authoritative jury I'm ever going to be in front of. I mean, whether this makes any sense. And so I thought, so this one guy, Emmanuel, said to me, he says, Theology of Migration. He said, some people think that the reason why we're suffering so much here in Africa is because we're descendants of Judas. He said, what do you think of that? And I thought, wow, that's a theology of migration. It's a bad theology of migration, but it is a theology of migration. So I said, well, here's another way to think about this, right? Here's my most important kind of message of the night. So if you're asleep, just wake up just for like 30 seconds, because don't miss this one. So I said to him, Emmanuel, here's another way to think about this. I said, God and Jesus Christ so loved the world that he migrated into the sinful and broken territory of our human existence. And there he laid down his life on a cross so that we could actually be reconciled to God and migrate back to our homeland. And so at every instance, God is constantly breaking down those walls and barriers to bring us back into communion again. That's the work of the faith. That's the work of the gospel. So I said, here are 4 foundations of a theology of migration. I said the first part is the image of God. And so that's why I look at all the narratives I've done over the years, all the people I've talked to, and all the things that they've said. And the one common denominator is just says, we just want to be human. We want to pass over from being inhuman to human. And you can see in this Eucharistic narrative that the Eucharist is based on the Passover narrative in the Exodus. It takes shape in Jesus' passing over from death to life. The Eucharist is a way of remembering his Passover and participating in that Passover with him. But they say, I just want to pass over from my inhuman existence to become human. One migrant said, I've stood away in baggage compartments of buses. He says, I've crossed through the mountains and almost baked to death. I've gone through the deserts and almost died of thirst. He says, I've almost frozen in the hills. And he says, I've been hungry and thirsty. He says, all that's difficult. He said, but that's not the hardest part about being a migrant. The hardest part is when people treat you like you're a dog and treat you like you're the lowest form of life on earth and like you're no one to anyone. And it'd be painful sometimes, even I remember even being at the border, the southern border, when people who had accounting degrees from Guatemala, and I remember these words, these were the exact words. He said, I will even be your slave. But nothing's worse than knowing your family doesn't have medication. And you'll work in the fields, you'll work, as doing anything you ask so you can send money back home. That's where you really see, high virtue at work and people giving themselves for the sake of others. The second foundation, I said to Emmanuel, is really the Word of God, which is about passing over the divine-human divide. Now, I thought about this as I was working on this Theology of Migration book, and it occurred to me that if we call Jesus' migration into this world the Great Migration, when that Great Migration happened and he entered into Mary's womb, if you will, Mary's already betrothed to Joseph. And to be found pregnant by somebody other than your betrothed will put Mary outside the law. And so when she went in haste to visit Elizabeth, it wasn't like I haven't seen her in a while and I can't wait to catch up with her. And she says, if I stay around Dodge, I can actually get stoned to death. Not alone just telling Joseph that, by the way, I'm pregnant, like what that would have meant for her. But she flees, she's got this news that suddenly this great migrant's going to be part of her home, in her womb, and she has to live with this mystery. And in this, that Jesus was really undocumented, illegal, and an alien. He was undocumented because when we went to Bethlehem, it was a census, and they had to really register their documents. He was illegal because he was born out of wedlock, and he was an alien because he really was from another world. And if you think about that, the good news begins with an undocumented illegal alien, that God chooses to save the world through an undocumented illegal alien. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. That God's mercy is so big that it's way bigger than any of the laws that we created, which I'm going to elaborate on in a bit. There's a translation of the scripture, the translation of the Bible called The Message. It's a great translation. It says, in the beginning of the chapter of Gospel of John, it says, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. It's a great translation. The third is the mission of God, which is, of crossing over the human-human divide. Many of you knew, I know some people in this room, Ed, Elena, would have known Father Virgil Elizondo. He's a great friend, a beautiful human being, taught me so much, was really my core mentor. And he had a great book. He had a great book called Galilean Journey. And in his Galilean journey, he said that Jesus grew up in Galilee to really began his proclamation of good news, outside of the centers of Jerusalem, outside of the religious center of Jerusalem, the political center of Rome, and the intellectual center of Athens. But he was in the middle of nowhere at the crossroads of everywhere. But the key, from there he proclaimed the kingdom. And the key symbol of the kingdom was the table. And he invited everybody to table. Everybody, sinner, tax collector, Gentile, all those who broke laws, the excluded, the marginalized. He brought those to table. And in welcoming everybody, Elizondo says, he rejected rejection, right? In welcoming everybody, he rejected rejection. But there were some people at that table and said, these people shouldn't be here. So they rejected Jesus. So he says the reject who rejected rejection is also the one who really rises from the dead. So he really vindicates Jesus' way as God's way. And so we see that really this human tendency to keep distinguishing, like this person doesn't belong, this person's, other, that really God's way is very different. So therefore the church's way in following Jesus is very different. This leads us to the vision of God, or the Visio Dei, which is really about passing over the country-kingdom divide. And I must confess, when I watch the Olympics, I watch the medal count every night. And I want to make sure that we're beating Russia in the wintertime and we're beating China in the summertime. That's just the way I wired. I love the Olympics, and I always look at that medal count at the end, Until I watch, the Russian skater or whoever just makes a sign of the cross, and I realize, my national identity is valuable and important, but it's not absolute, and that there are things more fundamental that connect us beyond our nationalities. And unless our identities keep evolving into more inclusive and godly identities, then they exclude and they alienate. So the vision of God is really crossing over the country kingdom of God, that my country doesn't define me alone, but it's the kingdom of God that does, which leads us to build bridges rather than walls, as Pope Francis said. I think at the heart of that, though, but if my vision of life is, this is mine, I've earned it, I need to protect it and keep it out, that's a very different vision of life than everything I have is a gift. That when I die, I will give it back, and I'll be judged by how I've used what I've been given, and I'm more a steward than an owner. That rests my life on a very different narrative. So in the end, this really brings us to the imitation of God, which is about crossing over the life-death divide. And that's not just what happens when we stop breathing. That also happens in the way we relate to one another. And in fact, if I don't see my connection to my brother or sister in need, then if the word alien is descriptive of anything, it's of me who've lost my humanity. Because in some sense, I have really lost I'm no longer in touch with my deepest human bonds, which connect me to one another and the way God made me. So there's more to say. I want to run through this last part very quickly because it just circle back to Lampedusa. I want to just say that in this last part, the communion rite really is about mission. And so moving from the theological territory, this is a small island. This is like the Statue of Liberty in Lampedusa. And there was a story of this boat here that was kind of drifting in the ocean. And the Coast Guard heard about it. They went out to intercept it, and they were bringing it towards land. And when they were bringing it towards land, the rudder broke. And there were about 328 people on board. And as they were bringing it towards land, it was drifting perilously towards the rocks. So they summoned the villagers of the community. Up until then, many days, bodies would just wash upon shore. One person there would get thoroughly depressed who was constantly picking up these bodies. But in this case, they finally brought him safely to shore, even at great risk to the people of the island. And when they brought him ashore, they thought, wow, this was a sign. We saved all these people, 328. So the boat stayed there on the shore for a couple days. It ended up breaking up into pieces. And when they actually kind of try to basically clean up the mess in the hull and everything like that, they found that actually a couple people didn't make it. So what was a symbol of salvation then became a symbol of death. So these are kind of some of the boats. This is the carpenter who eventually would make this chalice. This was the boat that I just talked about. This is some of the driftwood. And these are kind of, again, some of the other boats. But what he started to do is that I got to find a way of remembering these people who've died such nameless deaths. So he actually ended up started making crosses out of this driftwood. His name is Franco Tuzio. This is where some of the migrants who were on that ship that died, they were buried in an Arimathean grave. Somebody just donated a grave where they could be buried. But when Pope Francis decided to come there, he said, the Pope had actually had a choice of 4 chalices to choose from. And one of these he had made from the driftwood of this particular ship that I just mentioned. And so he used that chalice at Mass. He used a crozier that was made in the form of a ship's wave, and on it, you can see it too well, but it has fish, it has a heart, it has a loaf of bread. He had a lectern that was made from the rudders of some of these ships. And here he used this chalice very powerfully. If you're ever at Notre Dame, he's made 3 of these chalices from this boat. One of these I have at Notre Dame. This one stayed in Lampedusa, and the priest in Africa has the 3rd one. But he said when he was making this one, he said he took out this nail, and he said it had a big hole in it that was evocative to him of Christ's wounds. But then he said when he put the nail back in, it made the form of a cross. So on top of the cross sits the chalice of life. Very powerful theological image. But this wood was particularly important because in that wood are the stories of the migrants. And actually, that's how I got back into woodworking again. I actually gave it up for 40 years, but I was working on this reflection. It kind of reawakened in me, again, kind of a love of woodworking and how wood tells a story. So now I take wood from campus and make things from that, but it was really the wood of Lampedusa that awakened me to this issue. It did remind me, there's a note from John Chrysostom. He said, in the early days of the church, priests had chalices of wood, but use chalices of wood, but they have hearts of gold. Now our priests use chalices of gold, but they have hearts of wood. It's a very powerful line. But in the end, this is all connected to communion. So I just want to do just a summary then of kind of all of this here is that, basically what I've been trying to talk about today is one, to talk about the global refugee crisis, it's affecting not just the United States, certainly very particularly here. But the second is talking about Pope Francis, who really condemned this globalization of indifference. But then to highlight John Paul II, too, also spoke about really the importance of a globalization of solidarity. And all of that, but really saying underneath what the Eucharist is about, and finding this connection between what's happening outside, in the world and inside the churches, is really about communion. It's really one narrative, saying, are we moving closer to that communion? Are we moving away from that? That's really the central question of life. Are we moving closer to that? So where that brings us to is then looking at this Eucharistic narrative and saying that in the end, so many ways the people we're working with in this space, it is the journey of the nobodies. Nobody even knows what's happening to them. One of the things that got this carpenter into it is that he said that there was one day that they had an earthquake and 300 people died in Italy, and they had a national day of mourning. Stores were closed. Everything was shuttered. Airports, also were closed. He said, at the same days, there was a shipwreck where 325 people died and no one even noticed. And he says, that's when he said, really, some people die first-class deaths and other people just aren't even recognized. So Francis wanted to really bring attention to these nobodies, but he also wanted to acknowledge that they're just trying to be somebody. And in the end, to say they're connected to everybody. And that underneath all of that, and this was even some of the work as well, and the last part of my book, really looking at the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, one of which, Joanne has featured your organization. I know it's changed names a couple of times, but it's really the work of basically liberating people from prison, feeding the hungry, all the work that many of you are doing. But all of that is really saying that we do this because there's a connection to the body of Christ. And so what we're celebrating sacramentally is also what we're living into ministerially. So my last word here is just to say that in the end, where that leads us is really to highlight maybe 4 parts of a theology of migration. One is the Incarnation, in saying that this is about God, the God who first migrated to us. Second, it's about the church, who really is, we are migrants in this world. Thirdly, it's about discipleship, which is really about a challenge to human solidarity and seeing our interconnectedness. And lastly, it's about eschatology, which is about our homeward journey back home. Right? When I finished sharing some of these thoughts with this these refugees in Morocco, I wasn't sure what they were going to say. And I was a little nervous once I kind of got it out there and stopped speaking like I am now. And, but I can tell you what this one refugee, Emmanuel, what he didn't say. He didn't say, those are great insights, and I hope you get those published in a peer-reviewed journal article someday. What was really interesting, it was a real moment for him because he didn't even look at me. He looked straight up, and he looks up and he goes, "Yay, God!" He said, "Thank you for doing that for me." And it was like one of those moments like, oh, that's what I'm doing. And which reminds me of what I'm doing tonight, which is to share some reflections really on the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, "I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, sight to the blind, liberty to captives, and a year of favor from the Lord." So thank you. We've got a few minutes, and you just kind of open it up for any conversation. Thank you. Any reactions, commentaries, anything that touches your experience?
I think we all feel that tension between the civil law and the natural law, and where our allegiance and action lies. Any thoughts on that?
It's a good question, and I think in the beginning, I think, look, these people are just trying to live a dignified life. I think where I started to really change my thinking on this was when I was in Guatemala, Honduras, and I really realized, the rule of law is not working here. And people are being exploited, tortured, taken advantage of. The justice systems are not working, the courts aren't working, the cartels are controlling this. And I'd say you need a law, you need a rule of law, and the rule of law is important. So that's why there's a paradox here where, or if not a contradiction, where sometimes migrants are crossing the border, breaking the law so they can have protection of the law. But I think the point here is just to reflect that it's not enough to just say, and this is where Danny Carroll from Wheaton College, I think, says this much better. And he says that in Romans, he says, obey every law. But prior to that, the prior chapter says, your mind must be renewed constantly in light of the mind of Christ. And so it's not enough to say, here's the law, end of discussion, because sometimes injustice can be made legal, And so the tension is really to say, is this aligned with laws? And so what the church would say, that there is a value in controlling borders and having laws that do that. But there's an international common good, and even what we hold as our own is subject to a larger social good. That's where it gets hard. But right now it short circuits at the level of national sovereignty. But the church speaks more deeply to that.
I want to affirm and thank you for that. You said it kind of almost flippantly, we got to realize this is not an American issue. Oh, we got to realize that this is not an issue, something going on in the United States. Our famous president has made it like his issue, like he's the migration guy. Oh my gosh, that's so not true, and I really appreciate your perspective. And the fact that you spent time, talking to, walking with, being with Border Patrol people. I think we need to have that dialogue. I mean, last Sunday's gospel says, love your enemies. Let's figure this out. We have to stop, demonizing the other side, especially liberals like me.
Yeah, I think for me, the scales fell off my eyes at times when I was working with the Border Patrol agents and seeing some of the humane things they did to other people. And that's where I kind of realized that I had to move beyond my own walls and borders. That's why it's not just geographical, it's also mental, and we have to see the humanity in everybody, even people we disagree with. That's why I kind of go through that long discourses of saying, here's different positions. You can't just say you're wrong because you think differently. Sometimes they're really aiming at something that's really good. But we have to keep going deeper.
Kind of jumping off of that, if all of this is a pursuit of the eventual communion and community of our oneness in the image and likeness of God, and that's what we aspire to, that's the intent of our ministry. In like all of your experience, where have you found like the most successful common ground to begin this dialogue, this conversation that's essential to doing that, like given so many disparate voices and perspectives, and someone who's an advocate largely more of the natural law versus the civil law or something like that, these people with different perspectives, where do you find the most connective origin in those conversations, if you've had so many?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I'll tell you some images that keep going through my mind. Let me start with really was the hardest one and the worst one, which was Rwanda. We had a couple ask us to really work with them on the search for God from the context of genocide. They were in the hotel of what it was popularly known as Hotel Rwanda. They lost 130 members of their family 3 months after their engagement party when the genocide began in 1994, and they narrowly escaped death. But they asked us when I was asked to work with them, they said, "Will you work with us on the search for God from the context of genocide?" And it was one of these things I couldn't refuse. I knew it'd be so challenging to work on, and immediately I said yes. But the second thing I said is, I have no idea how to speak about God. So that to me was where this otherness was so extreme, that brother killed family member, or it was just I'd never seen anything quite like that. We did a book and a film on that, but I think that was still a very hard one to work through. It's a challenging one to see where this is really being done well. I think Germany started with Angela Merkel. I think really began to see in the Syrian situation that, hey, these are our brothers and sisters. I think Canada at times has had a better policy than ours. They've had more temporary guest worker programs, but even they become more restrictive and reactive. I asked some Germans at the time that Angela Merkel did this, and I said, why did she do this? She has nothing to gain from this politically. And she said, that both gave me different answers, same answer in different places. They said her father was a German pastor, and he knew Matthew 25. And he knew that really what you do to the least and last is really connected to our salvation. So they actually said that this political leader was really influenced by that. But I would say the best place I've seen this is Turkey. Turkey took in 3 million refugees coming from Syria, and they provided kind of a high level of humanitarian concern. And when I was with them with a delegation with some of their officials, I asked them, why do you do this? You have nothing to gain from this politically either, and you're getting a lot of pushback on it. And they said, these were our brothers and sisters. And they said, it's hard now, but they will thank us in the future. And what I took away from it, and it's important to kind of get this right, they paid the political cost for the humanitarian concern, whereas our leaders have paid the humanitarian concern for the sake of the political cost. Yeah, so, yes.
Okay.
While I agree with Ed that we can't demonize people, I do believe it's up to us to call out policies and behaviors that we think are abhorrent. And in terms of where do you start dialogue with people, I have found, for me, the best way is to ask the question, what would you do to save your child's life? What would you do to feed your family? And I oftentimes find people are stopped by that question, and it leads to sometimes a more fruitful discussion.
That's excellent. And, some things too, right? Recalling your history of your family's own migration history. It's interesting, in the book of Deuteronomy, Yahweh calls Israel to remember where they've come from. You're slaves in Egypt and so on. Why? Probably because they forgot it. They kept forgetting it. I think it's our tendency to forget it. And I think the biblical account is always saying, remember where you've come from. Oddly enough, it's that first generation that is often the most discriminatory against the migrants. Yeah.
Father Groody, thanks so much. Given a lot to think about. I'm very big on words and and how we use words, and your focus on the liturgy of the words is very powerful. Also need in the mix of that is kind of for me a liturgy of the silences, and the good silences, but also the bad silences, the those who are not speaking out, those who are, are sitting back and allowing it to happen. And then the other piece is the challenge to human solidarity. I always need to emphasize within myself that it's challenge to human divine solidarity. It's to the Christ that's within all of us, that it is that human connection, that incarnational connection with each other through flesh and spirit. And how do we live that out? How do we recognize that? And in regard to what Ed pointed out is, how do we recognize the Christ in others? So even when we're told to pray for our enemies and how difficult that can be, my tendency is to say, okay, I'm going to pray for the Christ, who I believe is in Donald Trump or Elon Musk or whatever, somewhere, and be able to ask that Christ to somehow come out of the tomb or whatever you want to say, but to, again, that connection in spirit and to the Christ that we believe and we teach is in all of us.
Yeah, I mean, we have to look at that deeper level, and I find this, especially in my students today, it's like when you walk around campus, it's everyone's got an earbud in them, we're so bombarded with noise that we've really lost the capacity to be silent. In the book, I actually do that at the end of the first section because, really let us pray. Generally in a mass, you can have an extended period of silence before you actually say any words. And I feel there's a real need for us to get back in touch. My students actually have to commit at the beginning of the semester to deciding how much time each day they're going to spend in silence and not do work, but to just listen to their heart. That is something that is in really short supply these days, and I think it's at the root of so many other problems which we have in society today. And even how you listen to that deeper image of God that's there even in people that disagree.
Hi, one part that I'm interested in that wasn't in your pie are the citizens of the country itself. And what I notice is that people have real fears about migrants. And some people fear about the loss of their culture, particularly older people. Some people fear based on things that may not be reality, about taking of jobs, or feel like it won't be America anymore. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, if you noticed any work being done on that area, because it's fine for all these different people to win their little war on whether it's going to be on economics or whether it's going to be on whether we're going to let people in or not let them in, whether they're going to treat. But unless the citizens of the country are part of that, people will always be looked at as inhuman as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we have to start there sometimes when people really name and acknowledge those fears. Then we have to ask, are those fears, legitimate or reasonable? And I think working in this ministry, I'm sure many people here would also say, it's once you have the encounter, and this is what Pope Francis really emphasizes again and again, the importance of encounter. Once you have the experience of really kind of hearing their stories, seeing their suffering, and amazingly, their generosity and commitment. So many times over, I found people with nothing giving everything they had. And I think that's, for me, which really touched my heart to say, these are not the people I need to be afraid of. But let me say, some of them, yes. I mean, like, when you really get into the world of the cartels, you get into the drugs, it's dark really quickly. Human trafficking, when we were doing some work in brothels with trafficking in Thailand, it got dark so quickly. So there are real things to be afraid of, That's real. Yeah. Yeah. No, it thickens. It begins to thicken, and when you begin kind of adding to that, like when you start speaking to the coroners, and when you go to these cemeteries in Southern California, where you see all these nameless bodies that are so decayed beyond recognition because they died in the deserts. This is where you begin to see these different values, and you begin to say, wow. So it's hard. It's really hard. And fear is really I think can take over us. But how we deal with change, too, is important. I did my mother's wedding. My mother got married after my father died, like 3 years later. And when you do your mother's wedding, you're like, this one I didn't see coming. And so afterwards, I'm like, the only constant in life is change. And so I realized that I can't just cling to what I had in the past. I've got to really be adaptable. We'll take one more question. I know it's getting kind of late, but we'll take one more.
All right, we got one over
Yeah.
here, but it's a repeat. If there's someone new. All right, then Father Larry.
One, again, another observation is, again, and we look at nationalism, we look at all this, but there's also this connection that we have that is unavoidable, that how we impact other parts of the world that forces migration to our country. So, for example, we have the largest market for drugs. We provide the largest market for drugs in this country. We have the greatest amount of addiction in the world in this country, which drives the cartels in South America and Central America, which then drives the violence that causes people to come here, seeking to get away from that violence. And we forget, and I think it's willful forgetting, that in many cases we are the cause of that because of our addictions and all those sorts of things. And at the same time, our gun industry, which is managing to send guns to other countries, again creating greater violence, forcing people to come here.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, but anyway, there's a lot more to say, but anyway, thank you all for coming, but even more, thank you for all the good work you're doing. I was really inspired by all that I saw this afternoon, and there's a lot of really good people in this community really trying to do good work, and I think what was said tonight, I think I will just repeat, and that is that this is a really hard thing to do just on our own, and I think, the only way to stay hopeful is to continue to do it together, and it's going to get harder. So I think, we have to just continue to band together. But thank you, all of you, for the great work you're doing. And thanks for just inviting me to share a few words tonight.
Before we all leave, I would like to invite you to stay for some hospitality. We have drinks, coffee, I understand, and lemon water and sweets behind this grill here. So please stay and talk to one another. We all have so much to say. Some of us have been talking all afternoon, but we'll still talk. I would like to invite you to do two things. One is, if you haven't signed an attendance sheet somewhere, I have absolutely no idea how many people are here, and I'd like to know. Don't give me your email address if you don't want to get email from me. And I know there are a lot of people who are out here that already get email from me, but I just want to know how many people were here. So please sign either this one that's on your table or the one that's in the back. The other thing is, if you would like to purchase Father Dan's book, Theology of Migration, scan this first QR code. It will bring you to the Orbis book website where you can order his book. What he didn't say, and I don't think anybody of us have said, that the foreword to the book was written by Pope Francis. This is, it's very moving. It's really good. It's worth it. And you covered so little of what was in the book. There is so much in the book that we didn't have time to talk about tonight. And then the other thing is that the other QR code is, if you can find it in your budget, we ask for a free will donation to help support this lecture tonight. And with that, I'll say, let's go have something to eat. Thank you.